We're back on Under the Ring, and so pleased to be joined by the managing editor of Wrestling Junkie, Nick Tylwalk. Nick, welcome.
Hey, Phil. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I guess the big question right off the bat is, what is Wrestling Junkie?
Well, Wrestling Junkie is what we hope to be the site where that will cover pro wrestling, sports entertainment, whatever your particular flavor of wrestling is, for the USA Today Sports Network. We got the name from our sibling site, MMA Junkie, which has been a destination for fans of mixed martial arts for years now, and also part of USA Today. And so we're hoping to bring the same kind of coverage that people have enjoyed for MMA Junkie to the world of pro wrestling. We think that there's a real opportunity for it. We feel like USA Today's network in general has not covered pro wrestling in depth for a long time. So there's an opportunity for it. And obviously, this is a really, really exciting time in the world of wrestling. We feel like a great time to be launching something new. And we're just excited to get out there and see if we're right about that.
It's very exciting. Who is this site for, and why should people check it out?
That's an excellent question, because obviously there are many, many different outlets out there already covering wrestling and doing a fantastic job doing it. But what we're hoping is that, we can give a little bit of something for everyone, right? Like, we're not going to be, especially right off the bat, someone that's going to a place that's going to be first to breaking news and rumors necessarily, because there are already people out there that do a great job with that have the resources to do that. But we're hoping that we have enough interesting, content for people who are hardcore wrestling fans who want every bit of tidbit of news that we can. So we're going to, aggregate the best news out there and make sure people are on top of that. And then we really do think that there is an opportunity for people who are, there is a lot of debate, I think, right now among the internet wrestling community, especially, about whether there is such a thing as a casual wrestling fan. And one of the things that struck us is we think that debate is kind of misframed, right? Because if you're WWE or AEW, let's say, that's a question that you do have to worry about. Like, are there people that might watch wrestling on a weekly basis, that might watch a national broadcast, that aren't watching? And how do we get those people to watch? And that's always the source of concern, especially on Twitter and some other internet communities. Like, do these fans exist? Are there people that we can convert to regular viewers? But we don't, for us at Wrestling Junkie, we don't think that's necessarily something that we need to worry about. What we do think that there are a lot of people out there who are lapsed wrestling fans. I think that everybody who is a pro wrestling fan knows somebody, whether it's a friend, a relative, people at work, that were into wrestling at one point, or are interested in catching up on what's been going on since the last time they watched. Maybe those people will never, become regular viewers to SmackDown or Raw or to Dynamite, but they want to know what's going on. Can they check in somewhere and say, hey, this is what's been going on since the last time I watched? Or it's WrestleMania season approaching, what's going on? What are the big storylines? What do I need to get caught up on to decide if I'm going to tune in this year? And I think that we can be that place that kind of puts things that are going on in context, gets people caught up quickly. And then if they want to dive deeper, we can have obviously content for them to dive deeper as well.
One thing that fascinated me as I was conceiving this podcast was, no matter who I talked to, the person would always come back to me with some contextual reason of, okay, this is when I watched, and this is who was wrestling when I was into it. And I realized at that point, gosh, is everybody a wrestling fan in some form? And I just didn't realize it. Like, why am I hearing about Alpha and Sika in 1983 from someone I'm not expecting to hear that from? How do they know it? So I think there is a chance with a lot of this stuff to find exactly those people that you're talking about too.
Yeah, sure. And in my mind, people of my age, or maybe a little bit younger, a little bit older, I'll freely admit to being in my 40s. But I think anybody who lived, especially through the Attitude Era, through the Monday Night Wars, wrestling was so hot at that point that almost everybody that I know, and obviously this is anecdotal, but people my age, people a little bit older, a little bit younger, even my parents kind of, were at least culturally aware of wrestling at that particular point in time. So I think, I like what you said. Like, I want to think that everybody is a wrestling fan or has been a wrestling fan at one point, or was at least curious about wrestling and possibly could be again.
How did you discover pro wrestling? And then after that, how did you get involved in wrestling media?
I was I don't know exactly when that I started watching wrestling, but I know that I watched the Saturday morning WWF at that point broadcasts when I was a kid, and I just kind of caught on to it there. And then I had my own period of time where I lapsed. Once I got to high school and to the early parts of college, I was just too busy with school and school activities, and I kind of lost. I didn't really lose interest in it. So much as I just got too busy for it, I think. And it was really I went to college at Duke University, and I think being down there in North Carolina, obviously a regional hotbed of pro wrestling, and getting exposed to it again, and then just having it be that moment in time again. I was still in college in 97, 98, and I remember working part-time jobs at it was a place called Damon's, which is no longer open now, but it was kind of like a rib restaurant and sports bar. And they would show, if I was working Monday nights, they would show both Dynamite. They would show both Nitro and Raw every Monday night, and then they started showing both WWE and WCW pay-per-views too. So I think that helped draw me back into it as well. Just having the communal experience, and then going to shows like in Winston-Salem and Greensboro and places around there. Kind of helped rekindle my love for it. And then as far as how I got into wrestling media, I started reading, just to catch myself back up, kind of the same thing that we're hoping to do at Wrestling Junkie. I wanted a place where I could kind of go and catch up on what I had missed. And I don't know how I came across it, but the one that I gravitated toward was called Slam Wrestling. And Slam was part of, at that point, the Canoe family of newspapers in Canada, and part of the Sun Media. And I was just kind of taken by the fact that, hey, they were part of this family of newspapers, so really grounded in real journalism, if you want to say that. And, their coverage was great because they did everything from things that I had missed. They were really good at the history of wrestling, putting things in context. And then they were covering current stuff too. So I just kind of fell in love with their coverage. And as it turns out, they got to a point where their guy who was doing regular WCW Nitro reports left the site. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but they just kind of put out a general call for someone to fill in for them on TV reports. And at the time at Duke, I was studying. I wanted to be a sports journalist at that point. So I worked for the newspaper there, and I was taking journalism classes, and I rightly or wrongly was like, well, you're a decent enough writer. Maybe these guys will give you a shot, even though you have no real experience. And I reached out to them, and I'm glad I did, because they did give me a shot, and I caught on with Slam, and never really looked back. They were the first outlet of any kind to pay me any money, obviously not big money, as you might expect. To cover anything, and it was pro wrestling. So I latched on with them, and no matter what twists or turns my career path has taken since then, I was always with Slam right up until I got this job in some capacity.
What's interesting to me is I've never had a lapse as a wrestling fan, which is kind of, there's times when I've watched it less, in terms of volume, but I've never had one. And for me, that internet period in the 90s was kind of a rebirth of my fandom almost, because all of a sudden there was this whole world of real names and backstage stories that I had never heard in my life. So I was really just diving into that stuff. For me, it was the WrestleLine website that I first got into before I eventually kind of navigated my way through figuring out what pro wrestling journalism sort of looked like. That's an interesting point too, is just you mentioned about, does the lapsed fan really exist? One argument I've seen plenty of times lately is like, well, why do we need pro wrestling journalism? And I personally think it's really important for what the size and the scope of the industry is. Where do you kind of land on that? Why is wrestling important to cover?
I think, I understand why the question is posed, because obviously there are many more ways for wrestling companies and the talent themselves to get their stories out to the public, unfiltered, or, if you're more cynical, filtered the way they exact way that they want to. But I think wrestling journalism is important for the same reason that any kind of journalism is. And I think for people to be out looking for helping people uncover more stories in the world of wrestling. And as you know, having been around it for a long time, there are just so many stories, so many interesting ones of all kinds. Good stories, feel good stories, tragic stories, unfortunately, but all kinds of stories that need to be told. And I don't think that we can just fully depend on the people themselves to tell them. Sometimes they can't, right? Like the role of a good journalist, I think a lot of times, is to help tell the stories of people who don't either have an outlet or aren't sure how to go about it. So I think that's as important in the world of wrestling journalism as it is any other kind. And also just to be kind of a check on things, right? Like, not to disparage any particular company, but when you let the promotions themselves, get out all the news, you run into the same problem as you do with a government or a business or anything like that. You need to have somebody to be asking questions to hold them accountable. I don't want to make this seem like we're covering like world politics or anything like that, because at the end of the day, it is entertainment. But I think there's still a role for that, even in this part of the 21st century.
But even you look at the power players in wrestling, and WWE is a publicly traded company. AEW is owned by a very wealthy family, as is Impact, and
Sure.
Ring of Honor just was owned by a very wealthy company that's a media company with a lot of influence. So I think at the end of the day, for me, covering wrestling, as I was doing it, it was the same to me. I was also a sports writer, so for me, the reason that I loved sports writing was being able to tell stories that no one else could. Yeah. And of course, I had that exclusivity with wrestling too, because a lot of times nobody else wanted to write about it. So I just got to do it myself. So it's, whenever you have large groups of interesting people, there's always good stories out there. And I think that's probably the thing that strikes me most about wrestling, is that it's just a bunch of really weird, interesting people.
Yeah, like you couldn't ask for, I don't think. I mean, athletes in any sport are obviously interesting to people, but I think as far as like a colorful cast of characters, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find one more colorful than the world of wrestling, for sure.
And sometimes the real life people are more interesting than the characters, which is even more fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was you kind of touched on Attitude Era earlier. What was your kind of like favorite time in wrestling as a fan, and maybe were there any companies that you kind of connected with more than others, or shows?
I mean, I do think that kind of 97, 98, 99 era for me was really where it was at, for the reasons that I kind of described. I think for its ability to kind of pull me back in, and really having both WWE and WCW kind of in strong positions at the same time, was just really interesting to me. During the summers when I was in college, I used to work at an amusement park in Pennsylvania, Hershey Park, and it was great. I think at that period of time too, because you'd be working there during the summer, and I used to tell my son, back before you were born, in the late 90s, when I was working there, during the summer, you would see so many wrestling T-shirts just walking around the park. Those couple of summers, especially in the late 90s, a bunch of NWO T-shirts, a bunch of Austin 316 T-shirts, and I just, for me, I thought that was the coolest thing. I was like, wow, when I was a kid, wrestling was sort of, people knew about it. Obviously, Hulk Hogan and that era was huge, but it, in terms of like, was it accepted in the mainstream? Like, yes, but also no, right? Like wrestling was still, being a wrestling fan was still considered to be kind of like a niche, kind of nerdy thing. And I just really felt like at that moment in the height of the Attitude Era, when both companies were going well, like this is so accepted. It made me feel good. Like I was in on something before everybody else, and not in like a gatekeeper type of way, but I was like, man, people have come around, right? Like everybody else has come around and seen how cool this is too. And that was to me like the I don't know if that will ever quite, people talk about that a lot. Like, will wrestling ever be as big as it was? Like, of course, probably not, because the media and entertainment landscape has changed so much. So for me, like in my mind, that kind of moment in time where it became so mainstream, so, accepted, that really spoke to me.
I think right now is as close as I've seen since then to, what we enjoyed back then in the 90s. It's just AEW existing, as you said, in this time of like the nerd kind of fan culture, kind of creates a totally different dynamic. You've got WWE's first real competition in what are we at, 20 plus years now.
Yeah.
There are other companies that gave it a shot, but didn't have the backing and didn't have the support and didn't have the consistency, quite honestly, to keep up what AEW's done. So it to me, like right now, I feel like I don't have as much time as I used to in the 90s, but I think right now is probably, like you said, ideal time for something like this.
Yeah, and I think too, it has worked, right? Like AEW, like you said, the fact that they have existed, the fact that they're been successful so far, the fact that their broadcasts are on TNT and TBS and visible to a lot of people. Turner, I feel like, does a great job cross promoting AEW across other things that they do, basketball and NHL and just regular programming. That has created some awareness, and again, it's all anecdotal, but I do have people asking me about it. What should I watch it? What is it all about? And I don't recall another time since the Attitude Era where that was true, right? Where people who weren't regular fans or fans of wrestling on a weekly basis, let's say, want to check something else out and at least see what's going on.
What do you think are kind of the most significant issues in the wrestling industry, or what the most important news stories that we have either happening now or coming up here in 2022?
Well, I think one of the most interesting ones, off the top of my head, would be the Warner Discovery merger and what that means for AEW going forward. I think it's interesting seeing like people like Tony Schiavone and people like that are inside AEW say, well, we have faith that we're doing good things, and we're bringing value to the table, and we're good partners. They've been good partners, but you don't know what's going to happen, right? With a giant media company becoming an incredibly giant media company, the way that Warner Discovery is doing. So I think that's the most interesting thing to me is what's going to happen there. Like, has AEW established itself in a strong enough way? And it certainly feels to me like they do, but you never know when it comes to large corporations what they feel about it. And I think I saw Schiavone say in interviews do they want to be in the wrestling business, right? Because at the end of the day, that maybe even more so than dollars and cents. I don't know what AEW's financials are, obviously. I don't have a ton of insight into that, but are they creating enough value, however that's defined in a world, in the 2020s, to keep going? Like, will they get a streaming deal? People talk a lot about, well, maybe they'll be on HBO Max once Warner Discovery, settles its plans for streaming. And so I think that's to me like the biggest thing is, yes, we just talked about it. There's this landscape now where there are two big companies, and it's probably better for WWE to have competition. I think a lot of us that have watched this industry feel that way. So it would be a real shame if they hit, a roadblock. I feel like they're strong enough to if they have to search for another broadcast partner or something, they can probably do it. And of course, the cons can back it all day long if they want to. But that's really interesting to me because timing wise, right? It's probably not ideal. Like, they're just getting to the point where it's like, oh, we're here, we're a strong alternative, we're making waves, and then they have this big question now.
It's fascinating to me that it's actually what's remaining of the previous company that actually shut down the last big competitor to WWE, because Warner Media or Discovery, Warner Media, whatever it is now, is the kind of the descendant of what Turner Time Warner was, which is what ultimately canceled Nitro and Thunder and ended the Monday Night Wars and everything else. So I think that AEW has built up enough of an infrastructure there to survive. It's just a matter of whether they'll be a serious competitor, depending on what the landscape ends up being. And I don't think anybody could really tell yet. I think that the end of CNN Plus probably kind of alarmed some people in terms of, okay, they're serious about making some actual cuts in this Discovery merger. So, but yeah, I think that's the key. And really AEW's survival is the future of the wrestling industry, because it's provided not countless, because there's actually a finite number, but jobs, for people within the industry to get work outside of what WWE's normal, expectations, parameters, that kind of thing would be. So it's really like, to say that that could be industry changing is not an exaggeration at all.
No, definitely not. Yeah, and I think and then further, a little bit further down the road, right? Like eventually we're going to reach a post Vince McMahon era for WWE, right? As unthinkable as it is,
we're not going to reach that era.
Vince will be around forever, so we don't have to worry about it. Outlast all of us. Maybe that's true, but no, like seriously, like at some point we're going to reach a post Vince McMahon era too, and that to me is also fascinating, right? Because in terms of like one personality and the company kind of being like not only building their image but like running the show all the time for so many years and so many successful years, and then them not being involved anymore is like the most interesting question that could possibly be in my mind.
And to note, Vince McMahon is currently 76. His mother did die earlier this year at 101. So just to note that he has that in his genes somewhere. What do you like in WWE? What would you change if you were in charge?
Oh, I mean, what I do like is they still, I feel like, do a great job of coming up with interesting stories to tell for performers throughout the card, right? Not just main event people, but people all over, and of course they have to be, right? Raw is 3 hours each week. SmackDown is 2 hours each week. That's a lot of time to fill, especially Raw. And I think that we all have a time where we feel like, man, like Raw is dragging. It's so long. But that on the flip side of that gives a lot of a chance for stories to be told up and down the roster and across the card. And I think they're still the best at that, right? Making you care about performers regardless of where their spot is. And I really do think that they do a great job of that. And then obviously on the production side, except for sometimes the super rapid camera cuts, which is something that people joke about sometimes, they're unparalleled and they're the best there is at what they do. What would I change? Man, I just, well, first of all, I would let people keep both their first and last names. That would be the number one thing. Covering WWE programming, it just seems silly sometimes. I still can't believe that Austin Theory is just Theory. That doesn't even sound like a name to me. It sounds like a thing, an idea. It's mind-boggling to me. I don't really understand the naming conventions sometimes. But in a more serious thing would just be, kind of not to give up on younger talent after they get like one gimmick or one push. I think that we can all probably sit here and name a bunch of examples of people who have been brought up to the main roster from NXT over the last few years. And, they were really over at the NXT level, and then they get brought up to the main roster and they flounder. And that happens sometimes. People aren't always going to succeed on their first push, but it just seems to me, as an outside observer, that some of these people are only given like really one chance to fly. Like they're brought up and like, can you get over? Can we get you over on your first push? Oh, you didn't, and then they kind of fade away after that. So that stinks, and I wish they could get better at that.
I'm really interested to see what they do and how NXT grows, because what it was and then what it became and then what it changed to now, the current iteration of it, I was not a fan of when they first made that change to the 2.0. But I think that with a few months of hindsight, I'm realizing now, like, yeah, I think I didn't like that because there were about 30 people debuting at the same time. I didn't know anything about any of them. But over time, I've kind of seen like, okay, well, I think the long-term goal here is really to now like solidly just develop guys, talent for the main roster, which if that's what it is, then fine. I mean, I think the key with them though is they got to get back on the road because nobody is going to get any better working with the same people on the same level as themselves, less than once a week sometimes.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. Like they were trying to walk a little bit of a tightrope at one point by bringing in, established indie stars and trying to develop their own talent at the same time. And that was a tricky thing, right? I think that was a difficult balance to find. And so now committing to the whole, this is strictly developmental. Let's get these people on TV, see how they do. I think is worth it. And yeah, it's a bummer because people who are especially like serious wrestling fans really enjoyed the couple of years that they were bringing in a bunch of really, really talented people from the outside. But it is totally understandable the direction that they're going in now, and I honestly hope it succeeds. But I do agree with you. Getting back on the road is probably really important for them to take that next step.
What do you like about AEW, and what would you change?
I think exposing people to at the beginning, especially exposing people like Kenny Omega, right? Like one of the greatest wrestlers in the world, but someone who maybe a lot of people hadn't seen, and just giving them a platform, it was really awesome. It really great to see. And I think that they've done a really good job of continuing to showcase people who we, like regular hardcore wrestling fans, already knew were awesome, and getting them out in front of a mass audience. And then they've done a really good job of mixing in other people as well. They are doing a good job of I think of someone like Darby Allin. Like, would Darby have ever become a huge star through WWE just because of his size alone? It seems unlikely, right? But turning someone like Darby Allin into a star is fantastic. And not as somebody who's watched AEW from day one and didn't know really anything about him coming in and saw him wrestle at the beginning, I had no idea that he would get to the point that he's at now, and teaming him with Sting. Like, so just some of the ideas that they come up with have really, really, kind of, I think hit the mark. What would I change? I don't know that there's something that I would say, oh, this needs to stop, or else it's ruining my enjoyment of the product. But I do think that they sometimes still, you have. I don't want to say that their roster is too big. I don't want to open that can of worms because I don't think that there is such a thing as like, well, this is the limit of talented people. The more talented people that you have, to me, is a good problem to try to figure out, right? Like, I would much rather have that problem than, oh man, I don't know if we have enough people to create like 3 hours of interesting weekly TV. That seems way more daunting to me. But I do think that what they have right now is you see some people on Dynamite, let's say, and then people might not see them again for 2 more weeks. And that's hard, I think, sometimes, especially what we talked about, to tie it back into what we talked about at the beginning. If there's people who don't watch every single episode of Dynamite and Rampage religiously, if they miss the next time, the House of Black, let's just pick them. They do promos, but they're not always in ring action every week. And so if you're not tuned in when they do their promo, you might not see them again for a week and a half. So I think that might be the trickiest part for them is finding the right way to keep people engaged in certain talent when they're not on TV every single episode.
It's interesting you mentioned that too, because I feel like one of the things that WWE does well is if you don't watch for a week, they throw you about 15 video packages explaining everything that you missed. And it's overkill, honestly, for people who watch it every week. But if you didn't watch it, then you get caught up. AEW kind of goes the other way with that and just goes match, and usually fills in the gaps on social media. But there might be an audience they're missing by not kind of stringing you along. The whole key to wrestling is building stars and making it episodic. So you don't want to miss a piece of something that you wanted to see. So maybe that's probably the thing that I would say. There's no such thing as too many wrestlers on a roster too. I know people would argue that lately, but honestly, they probably need to avoid over niching themselves with Ring of Honor or anything else that they're doing partnership wise. I'm not sure that all their partnerships that they're in are going to be mutually beneficial. It's probably the best way I could put that, but it's, they have to have their eyes on next year and how they're going to survive if it's going to be with Warner, if it's going to be with somebody else, and they need to put themselves in the best position content wise to do that. I think we're going to move to something we've been calling the 3 count now. It's going to be 3 quick questions and your answers to them. Hopefully they're good. So I say that every time, but usually they're really kind of fun. So we can have a good time with it. Who was the first wrestler you ever met, and where were you?
The first wrestler I ever met was. Are you talking about in person, like face to face? Honestly, I think that the first wrestler I ever met was Randy Orton. And it was covering the first WrestleMania in Orlando, whichever one that was. I'm horrible, and this is something that people can absolutely make fun of me. So definitely do it, people, if you want to. But I'm horrible at remembering like years to events, like matching like WrestleMania 25 was this year. So I'm horrible at that. But I got to cover the first WrestleMania. There's been 2 WrestleManias in Orlando over the past like 15 years, right? So whichever one was first, I got to cover it for Slam Wrestling. I was there on site and just doing media interviews through WWE. We got to meet a bunch of the talent face to face in kind of like mini scrums, not like a huge like regular pro sports scrum, but like 2 or 3 of us at a time. And I believe that Randy Orton was the first person I talked to. And it was a really cool interview because at the time he would people were asking him about some of the out of the ring stuff and kind of calming down a little bit. And he told us that, what he wanted to do at the time was to become more of a family man. He had a kid on the way. And I asked him, is there somebody that you look up to on the roster to see, what's a good father? How do you balance family and this business, this crazy business? And he said, Rey Mysterio was the person that he looked up to the most. Is like this guy has it kind of all figured out. And still being relatively new to like in-person interviews, I was just fortunate to have the foresight to go over and tell that to Ray when we got a chance to talk to Ray. And he was like, wow, he seemed like legitimately like kind of a little bit surprised and humbled or honored, whatever you want to say, that Randy would mention him in that way. So that was cool. That was a cool, interaction for my first time getting to interview some of the superstars in person, and it turned out really well. So that was cool.
That's very interesting, and your answer for the first wrestler you met is way deeper than mine would be. Because mine, I was 10 years old at an autograph signing, and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff sneezed on my shirt. My mom had to like wipe it off. It was pretty funny, but
that's a much more like interesting story than mine. So I like it.
I did get to share that with his son on social media recently too, just because he was asking for different stories about Paul Orndorff, and I was like, "Well, I got a pretty good one." That was strange. Who's a wrestler that you've always liked and you don't think gets enough credit?
So, like underrated wrestler.
I hate that word, but yeah.
No. I see what you're saying. Man. That's funny because I was just thinking about this the other day. It's like, who are people who are not like necessarily in the main event, but you're like, man, they do a great job every time out. I think people like a Frankie Kazarian They do kind of try to position him that way, I think, a little bit on AEW as like, oh, here's a guy who's wrestled everybody, who has had great matches with a wide variety of people, but he's simply not on TV enough, I don't think, for maybe the average viewer or someone who hasn't followed his career to fully appreciate it. But I mean, he just seems like a pro's pro, can wrestle any style. He's great. So I would say Frankie.
And finally, what is the most interesting thing about writing about wrestling?
I think how much to and this was an interview question I was actually asked before I got my job at Wrestling Junkie, and it's like, well, if people are going to stay in character when we do interviews with them, how are we going to handle it? And that's not like a question that people in any other I don't think any other form of entertainment have to think about, right? Because it's not like if you go on a press junket for the Avengers and you get a chance to talk to Chris Evans that you have to worry about him staying in character as Captain America. Like nobody else even has to think about that question. So I think probably just the like semi-absurdity of the fact that you would have to think about that question and deal with it is probably like the greatest thing about covering this particular industry. Is like, well, you might have to deal with people who are going to like be 100% honest with you and 100% their true selves, and you might have people who are going to stay 100% in character with these very like rich, detailed characters that they build up, and then you're going to have people who are somewhere in the middle,
yep.
All over the spectrum. And I don't think it's if it's not unique to this business, I'd really like to talk to some of you other journalists out there and fill me in on the fact that this happens in other facets of life, because it doesn't seem like it would be.
I have completely had that happen to me. And I think the other piece of I can't stand the in character stuff because it just ends up being silly, especially when you're doing it from journalism and it doesn't really work. But yeah. The other thing with wrestling that you always have to look at is that it's sometimes, big piece of wrestling and like kind of the whole point of wrestling is it's a work. So a lot of times wrestlers will just try to work.
Yep.
Even when they're doing media interviews, and it's obvious.
Yep.
So it might not be as bad as, okay, I'm actually going to cut this promo as Carlito right now, for an example that actually occurred to me once. But you always have to understand where the person ends and the character begins, if that even is a thing, because in some cases it isn't really a thing too. So. Nick, thank you so much for this today. This is fun. I'm really excited about everything you guys are going to be doing with Wrestling Junkie. Excited about how I might be able to help you guys out with whatever you need. And where can people find Wrestling Junkie?
Oh, so we just went live, at the beginning of May. So we're definitely still kind of finding our way. But wrestlingjunkie.usatoday.com. Please come and check it out, because we've got a lot of good stuff that's in the works. Like Phil said, one of our big goals is to work more closely with this podcast right here, because it's there's so much potential here, and Phil is so connected and so knowledgeable. So really looking forward to working more with you as well going forward.
Likewise, thank you very much. All right, thanks again for coming.
Yes, thank you for having me.